I had spent weeks imagining how my 34th birthday would unfold. The private room at the French Laundry glowed with low light, the champagne chilled to perfection, and the dress I wore felt like an affirmation of every long night I had worked to get here. Cream silk clean lines, crystals that caught the flicker of candles. This was supposed to be my evening. Then Vanessa leaned across the table. Her hand swept the remnants of her plate, crumbled napkins, a peel of lemon rind, a smear of sauce, and dropped them into my lap as though I were a bin. She smirked, her voice carrying across the hushed room. "Now you look like a garbage can." The laughter I expected never came. My friends froze. Jessica's fork hovered in midair. Taylor's eyes widened. Ryan and Felix both looked as if they might intervene before they could. My mother spoke in that weary, indulgent tone I knew too well. "Vanessa's just uncomfortable with fancy places. Sydney, don't take it to heart." I felt the silk cling damply to my legs, the weight of every gaze at the table pressing into my skin. My smile came automatically trained from years of smoothing over the sharp edges my family threw at me. "It's fine," I said, though nothing about the moment was fine. Inside, something shifted, not a flash of rage, not even shame, something quieter and more final, a decision forming beneath the humiliation. I reached for my napkin, dabbing at the stain, hearing Vanessa's low chuckle as she leaned back in her chair. My friends remained silent, unsure whether stepping in would wound me further. I gave them the same smile I had always given, a signal that I could take it, but I no longer wanted to take it. My hand brushed the key fob in my clutch, a reminder of the sedan Sophia drove every day, still legally mine in title and insurance. I had called it safety when I kept everything in my name. Tonight, the word took on a different meaning. The evening limped forward, but the balance of power in me had already begun to shift, carrying me toward what would come next. When I finally shut the door of my apartment behind me, the silence felt heavier than the murmur of the restaurant. I slipped out of the ruined silk and hung it on the back of a chair, not because it could be salvaged, but because I wanted to see the damage in the morning light. It would remind me of what I had endured. I made coffee, though it was far too late for it, sat at my desk and opened the folder I had been building quietly for years. Every transfer, every wire, every so-called emergency lived here. Vanessa's voice echoed in my head. "Sid, the landlord's threatening eviction. Could you help just this one time?" One time had become 10, then 20. Phone bills, car repairs, recital fees, all slipping into my accounts as if obligation were written in my blood. Scrolling down, I saw the spa charges, the designer purse she insisted was a gift for Sophia, but posted proudly herself. The weekend getaways she claimed were mental health breaks, and then the sedan $32,000 of reliability, supposedly to help Sophia get to school. Every gas stipend and repair invoice still drafted from my account. All of it in my name, hidden under the word safety. My mother's soft favoritism rang like background music. "Your sister tries so hard when Vanessa dropped another job. Money isn't everything whenever I shared a promotion. Even last year when I became executive director." Diane sighed. "Just don't overwork yourself, sweetheart." Before turning the conversation back to Vanessa's big heart, I realized I had been chasing something I would never receive. Recognition, pride, even basic respect. I had tried to buy their love with tuition funds, utility checks, a birthday dinner meant to prove I belonged. The spreadsheet glowed back at me line after line of proof, not generosity anymore, not kindness, just a ledger of how thoroughly I had allowed myself to be diminished. And staring at those numbers, I knew it was time to close the account in more ways than one. The morning after I reached for my phone, before I even poured coffee, the first thing I saw was a notification Sophia had posted new photos. I tapped, and there it was, my dress stained and crumpled, a blurry shot from the restaurant. The caption read, "When rich auntie tries too hard." Guess the trash finally matched the outfit beneath it. Vanessa's comment glowed a string of laughing emojis. More screenshots rolled in from friends who had seen the post before I did. My phone buzzed with messages. "Are you okay? Want me to come over? Ignore them. They're cruel." I typed out thanks but asked for space. I didn't want witnesses to the ache in my chest, not again. I replayed the night in fragments. Not just the moment Vanessa dumped the scraps into my lap, but the way my mother reached for Sophia's hand afterward, soothing her as though she had been the one wounded, the way Vanessa leaned back in her chair, triumphant, measuring her importance by the silence she forced from everyone else. The pattern stretched back years. Every award I earned, every promotion, every milestone diminished or dismissed. While Vanessa's stumbles were praised as effort, my achievements were smothered under warnings not to get ahead of myself. And I had accepted it quietly, handing over money favors and pieces of myself, hoping someday they would see me. Across the room, my gaze landed on the sedan's key fob hanging on its hook by the door. It gleamed faintly in the light, an object that seemed small but carried the weight of years of avoidance. That car was mine on paper, mine in truth. Yet in practice, it had become Sophia's entitlement. The photo on my phone and the key on my wall told the same story. Boundaries ignored, respect discarded. I set the phone face down on the desk, my pulse steady in a way it hadn't been last night. Something had shifted. The next move would not be theirs. It would be mine. By noon, I had stopped shaking. The photo, the captions, the comments, they no longer burned in the same way. What remained was colder, sharper, and strangely steady. Revenge would have been easy, maybe even satisfying for a moment. But what I wanted was something else. I wanted consequences. I opened my laptop and began with the credit card. Vanessa had been an authorized user for nearly 3 years. One phone call and a few typed commands erased her access. The representative explained the pending charges would still process, but nothing more could be added. I confirmed, my voice calm. When the call ended, I sat for a long moment in the quiet, letting the weight of it settle. Next came the recurring transfers, the quiet siphons I had set up over time. Rent patches, stipends, the monthly gas money that had long since outpaced the cost of a full tank. Each click that canceled an automatic payment felt like closing a door I had left unlocked too long. Finally, I turned to the sedan. I pulled the file from my cabinet, title, registration, proof of insurance, all bearing my name, the loan agreement, the payments, the maintenance records, every detail documented. I scanned copies, then called a towing service near Sophia's school. I explained that I was the legal owner reclaiming my vehicle. They required proof, which I emailed immediately. We set the pickup for the following morning during her dance practice. Once the logistics were in motion, I composed a single text and sent it to all three. "We can talk at my apartment today at 3. No explanation, no justification." The responses came quickly. Vanessa first, her fury spilling through the screen. "Are you insane? You can't just cut me off like this." Diane followed with her predictable guilt. "Sweetheart, families don't keep score. You're being petty." Then, "Sophia, the car is mine. You can't just take it away." I typed only one reply, the same to each. "We will discuss it at 3. For the first time, the conversation wasn't happening on their terms. The clock was ticking toward my door, and I was ready. The call came exactly when I expected it. At 7:50, my phone buzzed with Sophia's name flashing across the screen. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was shrill, frantic. "My car is gone. Someone stole it from the school lot while I was inside." What am I supposed to do now? I kept my tone even. "It wasn't stolen, Sophia. It was reclaimed. The car is mine, titled, registered, and insured in my name. I loaned it to you. That loan is over." There was a pause. Then the flood began. "You can't do that. Everyone knows it's my car." "I need it for school, for dance, for everything. You're ruining my life." Her voice cracked as the threats shifted into tears. "Please, Aunt Sydney, I'll delete the post. I'll apologize. Just give it back." My chest tightened, but I stayed steady. This isn't about punishment for a single post. It's about years of behavior. The car was always mine. Now it's simply back where it belongs. She hung up on me, the line dead before I could say more. Minutes later, Vanessa's name lit my phone. She didn't bother with greetings. "How could you do this? After everything I sacrificed for you, I raised Sophia on my own while you lived in your perfect high-rise. And this is how you repay me." I waited until she ran out of breath. "Vanessa," I said softly, What exactly have you sacrificed for me? Silence long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she muttered something about never mind and slammed the line shut. By 9, Diane called. Her voice carried its usual mix of weariness and rebuke. Sweetheart, this has gone too far. Families help each other. You know that. I closed my eyes and let the words sit before answering. You're right, Mom. Families help each other, but help without respect rots love. And that's what's happened here. She sighed heavily, trying to shift the weight of the conversation back onto me, but the words were already spoken, and they couldn't be taken back. The clock ticked closer to 3 when they would all face me in person. At 3 sharp, the knock came. I opened the door to find Vanessa flushed with anger, Sophia sullen and puffy-eyed, and my mother wearing her martyred expression. They swept in without waiting for an invitation, carrying the storm with them. I had prepared for this moment. On my dining table lay 3 binders, each labeled and tabbed bank transfers, credit card statements, screenshots of social media posts. I gestured toward the chairs. Sit. We need to go through this together. They hesitated, then complied. I opened the first binder. Over the past 5 years, I've transferred to your accounts just under $48,000, most of it described as emergencies, rent, utilities, tuition, gas, but also concert tickets, spas, and weekend getaways. Vanessa shifted in her seat. You make it sound like I was stealing. I didn't argue. I turned the page. The credit card. You were an authorized user. That's over $3,000 in charges. Restaurants, shopping, hair appointments. As of yesterday, that access is closed. Sophia scowled. You can't just take the car, too. Everyone knows it's mine. I slid the title across the table. My name gleamed in bold print. The car was always mine. I loaned it to you. That loan is over. What remains is the education fund. It stays in trust for college and only for college. Diane's voice softened. Sweetheart, you're overreacting. Families shouldn't keep track like this. I met her eyes. I never wanted to keep track. But when kindness is mocked, evidence is necessary. These aren't accusations. They're facts. The room fell silent except for the rustle of paper. They cycled through familiar tactics, minimizing, blaming, even tears. But I didn't flinch. I repeated the terms with the same calm, each time steady as the records in front of me. For once, I wasn't searching their faces for approval. I wasn't hoping they'd finally see me. I only wanted to be understood. The silence stretched until even their protests lost force, leaving the weight of numbers between us as the only truth. The silence broke with Vanessa's voice, sharp as glass. You think this will hold up? I'll take you to small claims court. You gave Sophia that car, and everyone knows it. I slid the title back toward her, my tone even. The law recognizes ownership, not hearsay. My name is on the papers. Any court would see that. Sophia leaned forward, fury shaking her voice. Then I'll expose you online. Everyone will know what kind of person you are, humiliating your own family for attention. I held her gaze. Every post you make can be documented. Every lie leaves a trail. If you want your friends to know you lost a car you never owned, that's your choice. But I won't be shamed into silence. Diane clasped her hands together, her eyes pleading. Enough of this. Just apologize to one another so we can move on. That's what families do. My chest ached, but I kept my voice steady. An apology that comes with conditions isn't real. You want me to forget what happened so the money flows again. That's not reconciliation. That's transaction. Vanessa slammed her hand on the table. You don't get it. You left home and I was stuck with Mom. You think you've suffered, but I carried the weight you walked away from. The words hit differently, a raw admission slipping past her anger. I leaned forward. I left to survive. You learned to survive by leaning on me. Neither of us got what we needed, but we're old enough to face it now. I slid a folder across the table. Here's a budget template. Here's a hiring contact in the city. And Sophia, the education fund is still yours when you enroll in college, not before. These are bridges, not handouts. But the car and the credit are gone. No one moved. The hour wound down with no truth, no embraces, only the clarity of what had been broken and what might one day be rebuilt. When they finally stood to leave, the binders remained on the table, heavy with proof, while I felt lighter than I had in years. The first days after the confrontation were strangely quiet. No constant buzz of requests, no late-night crises disguised as emergencies. I half expected the silence to crack open with a new demand, but instead, only echoes filled the space. On the third day, Vanessa posted on social media, "Betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from blood." The comments were fewer than she'd hoped for the sympathy shallow. By evening, the post had slipped into the endless scroll and her storm fizzled before it ever reached me. Diane called once her voice measured. "Your sister is struggling," she said softly, as if it were my cue to swoop back in. I didn't take the bait. "What is Vanessa trying this week?" I asked instead. The question caught her off guard, and she quickly ended the call. Then a different message. "Sophia." Just one line. "Got a job at the consignment shop." I stared at the words for a long time, weighing their simplicity. My reply was shorter still. "Proud of you." It felt like the first real exchange between us unclouded by demands. Alone, I began noticing how much of my life had been shaped around proving something. The dinners, the clothes, the curated perfection of my apartment, all designed as evidence of worth to people determined not to see it. I canceled the order for a new designer bag I'd convinced myself I needed, then enrolled in a photography class at the community center instead. The quiet grew, but it wasn't emptiness. It was space finally mine, sturdier than I remembered it could be. And as the weeks unfolded, that silence began to shift into something else. Signs that change, however small, was taking root. By the end of the month, the first cracks in their resistance began to show. Vanessa, no longer buffered by my transfers, took a second interview at a logistics firm. To my surprise, she got the job office coordinator with steady hours and benefits. She didn't call to announce it, but I heard through Diane, whose voice carried more relief than complaint for once. Sophia, too, started adapting. Without the car, she learned the bus routes and carpooled with classmates. Her texts became brief updates rather than barbs saving for school, looking at in-state programs, dance departments that don't cost a fortune. It was practical in a way I'd never seen from her before. Even my mother shifted in small but noticeable ways. Our weekly calls no longer spun into recitations of Vanessa's struggles. Instead, she asked about my clients, my photography class, even the weather off the coast. Sometimes she slipped, but I redirected gently, and she followed. Then came the dinner. Just a simple meal at her house, roast chicken salad, nothing extravagant. My friends weren't there, and there were no theatrics. We passed dishes. We ate, and for once, the air wasn't heavy with tension. Afterward, Sophia asked to speak with me outside. We stood in the small garden as twilight set in. She didn't stall or blame. "I need to apologize," she said quietly. "What I did was cruel. I was jealous, and I lashed out. I'm sorry." The words landed differently from anything she'd said before. I nodded. "I accept your apology, but trust isn't instant. It takes time to rebuild." She agreed, and for the first time in years, I believed she meant it. I walked back inside with her, knowing the real test was still to come. When my 35th birthday arrived, I chose quiet over spectacle. No reservations, no silk sheath, no grand gesture meant to prove anything. Just a home-cooked meal in my mother's kitchen, the camera from my photography class resting on the table beside the dishes. The room felt different this year. There was laughter, but it wasn't forced or bought. It wasn't measured by the size of the bill. Sophia handed me a folded card she'd made herself. Careful brushstrokes forming a bright design. Inside was $200 saved from her job at the shop. "It's not much," she said, but I wanted to give back something. I held it with more reverence than any luxury gift I'd ever received. Vanessa's present was simple, a cookbook she'd chosen because I'd once mentioned wanting to cook more at home. It was modest but thoughtful, and that was what mattered. When the time for toasts came, Diane raised her glass. Her voice was steady without the sharp edge of comparison. To Sydney, she said, "Who showed us how strength and love can live together? I'm proud of the woman you've become." I sat in the warmth of that moment, realizing that boundaries hadn't destroyed us. They had given us the only chance to grow into something real. Back home later, I hung my coat and glanced at the car keys still on their hook. They weren't symbols of power anymore. they were proof that I finally drove my own. Sydney's journey reveals a profound lesson about the power of boundaries and self-respect. For years, she sought validation from her family through financial support and grand gestures, only to face mockery and entitlement exemplified by Vanessa's cruel act at her 34th birthday. This pivotal humiliation sparked a shift, teaching Sydney that love cannot be bought and respect must be mutual. By meticulously documenting her contributions and reclaiming her assets like the sedan, she asserted her worth not through revenge, but through consequences. The silence that followed, free of demands, allowed her to rediscover her own space and priorities, like enrolling in a photography class instead of chasing status. Sydney learned that setting boundaries, cutting off Vanessa's credit access, and reclaiming the car was not about punishment, but about preserving her dignity. This clarity transformed her relationships, fostering genuine accountability from Vanessa and Sophia, and even softening her mother's favoritism. By her 35th birthday, Sydney embraced a quieter celebration, finding joy in authentic connections rather than purchased approval. Her lesson is clear. True strength lies in valuing oneself enough to demand respect, creating space for real, reciprocal love to grow.
The quarterly shareholders' meeting at Thompson Manufacturing was always held in the same sterile conference room on the 15th floor. Same mahogany table, same leather chairs, same view of the industrial district where Dad had built his empire over 30 years. And always the same seating arrangement. The board members around the table, Dad at the head as CEO, and me in the corner chair with my laptop taking minutes. Administrative assistant. They called my position, though I'd been doing it for 6 years now since graduating from Stanford with my MBA. Dad had insisted I learn the business from the ground up, before considering any real role in company operations. The ground up apparently meant taking notes and keeping quiet during important discussions. Today's meeting was particularly tense. Thompson Manufacturing was facing its biggest decision in decades: whether to accept a buyout offer from Meridian Industrial, a massive conglomerate that had been acquiring smaller manufacturing companies across the Midwest. "The offer is substantial," announced Robert Chin, the board chairman and Dad's oldest business partner. "Meridian is proposing $450 million for full acquisition." Board member Patricia Williams leaned forward. "That's almost triple our current valuation. It's hard to ignore numbers like that." James Peterson, Dad's golfing buddy who'd been on the board for 15 years, nodded enthusiastically. "We'd all walk away wealthy. Very wealthy." Dad, however, looked unconvinced. At 62, Thomas Thompson was still the formidable presence who'd built this company from a single machine shop into a major regional manufacturer. His thick gray hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable, and his expression skeptical. "Meridian has a reputation for gutting the companies they acquire," he said firmly. "They'll keep the contracts and the equipment, but they'll eliminate jobs. Half our workforce would be gone within a year." "That's business, Tom," Peterson replied. "We can't run a company based on sentiment." "It's not sentiment, it's strategy," Dad countered. "We've built something sustainable here. Thompson Manufacturing has been profitable for 28 consecutive years because we maintain quality and treat our people well." I continued typing, documenting every exchange while staying invisible in my corner. This was familiar territory: Dad's principled stance against what he saw as corporate raiders, the board's growing interest in cashing out, the tension between legacy and profit. What they didn't know was that I'd been analyzing Meridian Industrial for months. Not officially, of course. Nobody had asked the administrative assistant for strategic analysis. But I'd studied their acquisition patterns, financial statements, and post-merger performance data. Dad's instincts were correct. Meridian typically eliminated 30 to 40% of acquired workforce within 18 months while extracting maximum short-term value. "The question," Robert Chin continued, "is whether we want to remain a family business with limited growth potential, or take this opportunity to maximize shareholder value." Dad's jaw tightened. "Limited growth potential? We've expanded our market share by 12% in the last 2 years. Regional market share," Williams corrected. "Meridian offers national distribution, international contracts, economies of scale we could never achieve independently. At the cost of our independence and our workers' jobs." Peterson spread his hands diplomatically. Tom, I understand the emotional attachment. You built this company. But we have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. $450 million is more money than most of us ever dreamed of. That's when Dad made the mistake that would change everything. He stood up, commanding the room's attention with the authority that had made him successful for 3 decades. His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Gentlemen," he began, then paused and glanced at Williams. "And lady, this decision requires serious business analysis, not emotional reactions to dollar signs. We need to think like experienced executives, not amateur investors." The room fell silent, waiting for his conclusion. Some of you might be swayed by Meridian's offer because it seems like easy money. But real business decisions require understanding market dynamics, competitive positioning, long-term value creation. His eyes swept the room with obvious confidence. These are complex concepts that require years of operational experience to fully grasp. Then he looked directly at me, sitting quietly with my laptop, and delivered the words that would end his control of the company he'd spent 30 years building. "Leave business to the men," he declared with absolute authority. "Women don't understand manufacturing." The board members chuckled, a mixture of nervous agreement and habitual deference to Dad's pronouncements. Even Williams, the only other woman in the room, managed a tight smile that suggested she'd learned to pick her battles carefully. I sat quietly, fingers poised over my keyboard, and continued taking notes. The meeting progressed through financial reports, operational updates, and preliminary voting procedures. Dad outlined his vision for continued independence, emphasizing employee loyalty, community relationships, and sustainable growth. It was a compelling presentation, delivered with the passion and expertise that had made him successful. The board listened respectfully, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely torn between sentiment and profit. What none of them realized was that Dad had just made the most expensive comment of his career. When the formal meeting concluded 2 hours later, board members began filing out, discussing dinner plans and golf schedules. Dad was gathering his papers, still confident in his ability to convince them that independence was the right choice. That's when Robert Chin approached my corner table, where I was closing my laptop and organizing my notes. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "could I speak with you for a moment?" I looked up, expecting some administrative request about meeting minutes or scheduling. "Of course, Mr. Chin." The remaining board members had paused their conversations, sensing something unusual in Chen's tone. Dad looked over with mild curiosity, probably wondering what administrative detail required the chairman's attention. Chen's next words changed everything. "As majority owner of Thompson Manufacturing," he said clearly, "what are your instructions regarding the Meridian Industrial Acquisition proposal?" The silence in that room was absolute. Dad's expression didn't just freeze, it shattered. The confident authority he'd displayed throughout the meeting disappeared, replaced by complete bewilderment. "Majority owner?" he repeated slowly. I closed my laptop and stood up, meeting Chen's eyes directly. "I'd like to schedule a special board meeting to discuss strategic alternatives. Meridian's offer deserves careful consideration, but we should explore all options before making a final decision." Peterson was looking back and forth between me and Dad like he was watching a tennis match played by invisible players. "I'm sorry, what's happening here?" Williams had gone pale. "Robert, what do you mean majority owner?" Chin opened his briefcase and removed a folder of documents. "Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there's been some confusion about the company's ownership structure. Ms. Catherine Thompson currently holds 51% of Thompson Manufacturing's shares." Dad found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "That's impossible." "Actually, it's quite well documented," Chin replied, distributing copies of share certificates and transfer documents. The majority position was accumulated over 6 years through a series of carefully structured purchases. I watched Dad scanning the documents, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and growing comprehension. Each page confirmed what Chin was telling them. I owned controlling interest in Thompson Manufacturing. How? Dad managed. It was a fair question. How does an administrative assistant acquire 51% of a major manufacturing company without anyone noticing? The answer was simpler than they'd expect and more complex than they could imagine. It had started during my senior year at Stanford, when I'd written my MBA thesis on family business succession planning. My research had focused on companies where ownership and management became separated over time, often without founders realizing the shift was occurring. Thompson Manufacturing had been my case study. Dad had incorporated the company 30 years ago, issuing shares to raise capital for expansion. Over the decades, as the business grew and needed additional funding, he'd continued issuing stock to investors, banks, and business partners. The company had thrived, but Dad had gradually diluted his own ownership from 100% to about 35%. He'd never worried about maintaining majority control because the remaining shares were spread among dozens of small investors. No single entity held more than 3 or 4%. Dad controlled the board, ran daily operations, and made all strategic decisions. Majority ownership seemed irrelevant. What he hadn't anticipated was someone systematically acquiring those scattered minority positions. I'd started 6 years ago, immediately after joining the company. My first purchase had been a 2% stake from Mr. Anderson, a retiree who'd invested early and wanted to liquidate for his grandchildren's college funds. Then 3% from the Peterson Family Trust when James needed cash for his son's medical bills. 1% from former employee Sarah Martinez when she started her own business. Small transactions spread over years, purchased through a private investment entity I'd established. Never enough to trigger disclosure requirements or raise suspicions. Each seller was happy to get cash for shares in a regional manufacturing company they barely understood. By my 3rd year at Thompson Manufacturing, I owned 19%. By my 5th year, 42%. Last month, I'd purchased the final 9% from 3 different estate sales, pushing my holdings to 51%. Majority control of the company where I worked as an administrative assistant, taking notes and staying quiet during board meetings. The share purchases were all properly documented and filed, Chin continued, still addressing the stunned board members. Ms. Thompson has been the majority owner for approximately 6 weeks. Dad was staring at the documents like they might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Catherine, where did you get the money for this? Another fair question. Acquiring 51% of a company valued at $150 million required substantial capital, approximately $77 million over 6 years. I started with the trust fund Grandpa Thompson established, I explained. $22 million when I turned 25. I invested it carefully, focused on growth, and used the returns to fund additional investments. Dad's father had been a successful real estate developer who died when I was 15. His trust had been substantial, but everyone had assumed I'd use it for personal expenses rather than business acquisitions. The investment returns were sufficient to fund the share purchases, I continued, along with some leverage from banks that were happy to lend against Thompson Manufacturing equity. What I didn't mention was that my investment success had been exceptional. Starting with Grandpa's $22 million, I'd built a portfolio worth over $200 million. Thompson Manufacturing represented about 40% of my holdings. I'd learned from some of the best minds in business. Stanford professors, investment mentors, and 6 years of listening to board meetings where strategic decisions were discussed in detail. I'd understood market dynamics, competitive positioning, and long-term value creation before I'd ever set foot in Thompson Manufacturing. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Dad had been explaining that women didn't understand manufacturing, I'd been quietly acquiring his life's work. Peterson found his voice first. So when we vote on the Meridian acquisition, Ms. Thompson's 51% constitutes majority control, Chin confirmed. The decision is ultimately hers. Williams was studying the share certificates with professional interest. This is remarkable strategic planning. How long have you been working toward majority ownership? It wasn't originally the goal, I admitted. I started investing in the company because I believed in its long-term potential. The majority position was a natural result of continued acquisition over time. Dad was still processing, his expression cycling through emotions I'd never seen him display. Catherine, why didn't you tell me? I considered the question carefully. When would have been the appropriate time? During family dinners when you explained that I needed to learn the business from the ground up? During board meetings when you emphasized the importance of keeping family business decisions within appropriate hierarchies? Or perhaps during today's meeting, when you explained that women don't understand manufacturing? The board members were exchanging glances that suggested they were recalculating everything they thought they knew about Thompson Manufacturing's power structure. Chin cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should schedule a special meeting to discuss the Meridian proposal in light of this new information? Agreed, I said. I'd also like to review our current strategic plan, market positioning, and growth opportunities. There may be alternatives to acquisition that we haven't fully explored. Dad was gathering his papers with movements that seemed automatic, his mind clearly elsewhere. Catherine, we need to talk. Privately. Of course. But first, I'd like to make sure everyone understands the immediate situation. I looked around the table at faces that ranged from shocked to calculating to genuinely curious. I have no intention of making dramatic changes to company operations. Dad has built something remarkable here, and I respect both his expertise and his vision. But, Peterson prompted, sensing there was more. But strategic decisions going forward will be made collaboratively, with input from all stakeholders, including perspectives that might not have been considered in previous discussions. Williams was smiling now, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her all afternoon. Including perspectives from women who allegedly don't understand manufacturing? I returned her smile. Among others. The meeting broke up with arrangements for a follow-up session the next week. Board members left in small groups, their conversations urgent and speculative. Chin lingered to discuss administrative details and transition procedures. Finally, Dad and I were alone in the conference room where I'd spent 6 years taking notes and staying quiet. Majority owner, he said, testing the words. 51%, I confirmed. And you never mentioned this because? I looked out the window at the factory floor below, where 237 people worked jobs that Dad had created and I now controlled. Because every time I've tried to contribute to strategic discussions, I've been reminded that my role is administrative support, not business leadership. Dad followed my gaze to the manufacturing floor. I was protecting you. This industry is tough, demanding. I wanted you to understand the challenges before taking on real responsibility. I've been studying the challenges for 6 years. Market analysis, competitive intelligence, operational efficiency, workforce management. I understand them quite well. By taking notes in meetings? I turned back to face him. By listening carefully, asking the right questions, and doing considerable research on my own time. Also by acquiring first-hand experience with strategic investment, capital allocation, and business development. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that extended far beyond corporate ownership. $200 million portfolio? Approximately. At 31 years old? 28 when I started with Grandpa's trust fund. It's been a learning experience. He laughed suddenly, a sound that mixed admiration with disbelief. You've been sitting in meetings letting me explain basic business concepts while you controlled my company. I've been listening to your explanations and learning from your expertise while building complementary skills you weren't aware I possessed. Dad shook his head slowly. What happens now? It was the right question. What did happen when the administrative assistant turned out to be the majority owner? When the daughter who'd been learning the business from the ground up was revealed to already be at the top? Now we work together, I said. You have operational expertise I need. I have strategic resources you can use. Meridian's offer is interesting, but it's not our only option. What other options? I opened my laptop and pulled up a presentation I'd been developing for months, waiting for the right moment to share it. Regional expansion, international partnerships, vertical integration opportunities. Thompson Manufacturing is positioned for significant growth, but it requires capital investment and strategic vision. Dad looked at the first slide, then at me. You've been planning this. I've been preparing for opportunities. Today's meeting created one. Over the next 2 hours, I walked Dad through a comprehensive growth strategy that would double Thompson Manufacturing's revenue within 5 years while maintaining the workforce stability and quality standards he valued. It was ambitious, well-researched, and entirely feasible with proper funding and execution. By the time we finished, Dad was looking at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the protective paternalism that had defined our relationship for 6 years, but genuine professional respect. When did you become smarter than me? He asked. I didn't. I became differently smart than you expected. Dad gathered his papers one more time, but his movements were thoughtful rather than automatic. The board meeting next week is going to be interesting. Very. And the Meridian decision? I closed my laptop, considering the question that would define Thompson Manufacturing's future. We'll evaluate all options objectively and make the choice that's best for stakeholders. All stakeholders. Including the 237 people on the factory floor? Especially them. Walking to the parking garage, I reflected on the afternoon's revelation. 6 years of careful planning had culminated in a moment that changed everything in nothing. I was still Catherine Thompson, still committed to the company's success, still respectful of Dad's expertise. But I was no longer the quiet administrative assistant taking notes in the corner. I was the majority owner with 51% control and a $200 million investment portfolio, ready to prove that women could understand manufacturing quite well when given the opportunity. Sometimes the best business strategy was patience. And sometimes, it was simply refusing to accept other people's limitations on your potential. The next board meeting was going to be very different indeed. My 33rd birthday fell on a Tuesday, which meant the Anderson family gathering happened the following Saturday at my parents' house in suburban Denver. Same dining room where I'd blown out candles for 3 decades. Same relatives asking the same polite questions about my career. Same underlying tension about whether I'd ever amount to anything worthwhile. Growing up as the middle child between my sister Rebecca's medical school achievements and my younger brother Jason's law degree from Columbia had taught me early that academic success in the Anderson family was measured by prestige, not passion. Rebecca was finishing her cardiology residency at Johns Hopkins. Jason had just made partner at a White Shoe Manhattan law firm. And I was Dr. Sarah Anderson, molecular biologist, whose research into cellular aging mechanisms apparently didn't qualify as a real career. Sarah's still at the university, Mom would explain to distant relatives, using the tone people reserved for discussing chronic illnesses. Research. Very specialized. Dad was more direct. As a successful orthopedic surgeon who'd built a thriving private practice, he measured professional worth in terms of patient outcomes and annual income. My work studying telomere degradation in stem cells was, in his view, academic masturbation that contributed nothing meaningful to the world. "When are you going to get a real job?" became his standard greeting after I finished my postdoc at Stanford 5 years ago. One that actually helps people? The question stung because I genuinely believed my research could help people, potentially millions of them. For 8 years I'd been investigating why certain stem cell populations seemed immune to the cellular aging process that limited most tissue regeneration. My hypothesis was that understanding this mechanism could lead to treatments for age-related diseases, maybe even interventions that could extend healthy human lifespan. But trying to explain the clinical implications of telomerase activation pathways to family members who viewed anything outside their own expertise as irrelevant was like describing symphony music to people who'd gone voluntarily deaf. "Sarah's working on something with cells," Mom would tell dinner party guests, waving her hand vaguely. "Very complicated. Rebecca's saving actual hearts, though. She performed 3 surgeries this week." The comparison was constant and brutal. Rebecca's work was concrete, immediate, life-saving. She could describe her day in terms that anyone could understand. Blocked arteries cleared, heart rhythms restored, patients walking out of the hospital. My work involved cell cultures, microscopic imaging, and statistical analysis of molecular processes that took months to yield meaningful data. Jason wasn't much better. His legal victories were public, measurable, reported in newspapers. He won cases, negotiated deals, made headlines. My victories were papers published in journals that most people had never heard of, read by maybe 200 specialists worldwide. 20 papers in 8 years, Dad had said during last year's birthday dinner, as if he were announcing a terminal diagnosis. "How many people have you actually helped?" "Rebecca saved a dozen lives just this week." I tried explaining that basic research was the foundation for all medical advances, that understanding cellular mechanisms today would lead to treatments tomorrow, that some of the most important discoveries in history had taken decades to reach practical application. But Dad's attention would drift after the first few sentences, and the conversation would inevitably return to Rebecca's latest surgery or Jason's most recent courtroom triumph. The worst part was that they weren't wrong about the practical impact of my work. 8 years of research had produced exactly 0 treatments, 0 therapies, Zero interventions that had improved anyone's life in any measurable way. I had theories, hypotheses, preliminary data, and a growing collection of peer-reviewed publications that impressed my colleagues and meant nothing to my family. This year's birthday dinner followed the familiar script. Rebecca flew in from Baltimore with stories about a complex heart transplant she'd assisted with the previous week. Jason joined us via video call from his Manhattan office, where he was preparing for a corporate merger that would make national news. And I sat at the same chair I'd occupied since childhood, listening to my siblings describe their latest accomplishments while mentally rehearsing how I'd explain my recent grant rejection from the National Institutes of Health. "So, Sarah," Aunt Linda asked during the appetizer course, "how's your research going?" "Still working with those molecules." "Cells," I corrected gently. "I study stem cell aging mechanisms. Specifically, how certain stem cell populations maintain telomere length despite repeated division cycles." The familiar glassy-eyed look appeared on Aunt Linda's face. "That's nice, dear. Very scientific." Dad set down his wine glass with the slight thump that usually preceded his annual assessment of my career trajectory. I could feel the familiar tightness in my stomach as he cleared his throat and looked at me with the expression he typically reserved for delivering bad news to patients. "Sarah, I want to talk to you about something," he began, using his serious doctor voice. "You're 33 years old. You've been working on this research for how long now?" 8 years. 9 years if you count my graduate work," I said, knowing this would make his point stronger rather than weaker. 9 years. "And in all that time you've published." He paused, as if trying to remember the exact number from our previous conversations about my professional failures. 27 papers in peer-reviewed journals," I said quietly. "Including 3 in Cell and 1 in Science." "Right. Papers. But Sarah, here's what I don't understand. Rebecca performs surgery on real patients with real problems. She fixes hearts, saves lives, makes a tangible difference every single day. Jason wins cases that affect actual companies, real people, meaningful outcomes. But your papers, who reads them? What do they accomplish?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone at the table was looking at me with expressions ranging from sympathetic curiosity to outright pity. Even Jason, attending virtually from his office, had stopped checking his phone to watch my response. "Dad," I said carefully, "basic research is the foundation for all medical advances. The treatments Rebecca uses, the surgical techniques, the medications, they all started with someone doing basic research into cellular mechanisms." "But when?" Dad pressed. "When does your research turn into something that actually helps people? You've been saying, someday, for 9 years. Rebecca started helping people on day 1 of her residency." I felt the familiar frustration rising in my throat. How do you explain to someone that breakthrough discoveries often take decades? That most basic research never leads to practical applications, but the few studies that do revolutionize everything? That understanding biological mechanisms is valuable in itself, even if the clinical applications aren't immediately obvious? "You'll never publish anything significant," Dad announced, leaning back in his chair with the finality of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. 20 years of experiments, failed experiments, and what do you have to show for it? Rebecca saves lives. Jason wins cases. You write papers that sit in libraries collecting dust. The words hit like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel. Dad genuinely believed he was being helpful, pointing out hard truths that would motivate me to make better career choices. But because they echoed the doubts that kept me awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was wasting my life chasing discoveries that would never matter to anyone except a handful of academic colleagues. "Honey," Mom added in her most soothing voice, "your father just wants you to be successful. Maybe it's time to consider medical school? You could still become a doctor like Rebecca. Or law school," Jason suggested from the computer screen. "Your analytical skills would transfer well to legal research. I could help you get into Columbia." Everyone nodded along as if they were planning an intervention to save me from my own poor judgment. The birthday girl whose life choices had become the family's greatest disappointment. 20 years of failed experiments, Dad repeated, warming to his theme. "At what point do you admit that this isn't working?" I looked around the table at the faces of people who loved me but fundamentally didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. Rebecca with her cardiology residency and measurable patient outcomes. Jason with his partnership track and headline-making legal victories. Mom and Dad with their concrete definitions of success based on income and social status. Aunt Linda and Uncle Bob with their polite confusion about what exactly I did all day in my laboratory. Everyone agreed sympathetically with Dad's assessment. Nods around the table. Concerned murmurs about my career prospects. Gentle suggestions about more practical alternatives that would provide financial security and social recognition. I took a sip of wine and set the glass down carefully, considering my response. Time will tell, I said simply. Because what else could I say? That I was 6 weeks away from publishing research that would fundamentally change how the medical community understood cellular aging? That the data I'd been collecting for 18 months suggested a mechanism that could potentially extend healthy human lifespan by decades? That 3 major pharmaceutical companies had already reached out about licensing opportunities based on preliminary results I'd presented at a closed-door symposium? I couldn't say any of that because the final peer review process wasn't complete. Because Nature magazine's editorial board was still evaluating whether my research met their standards for publication. Because in science, nothing is real until it's published in a prestigious journal and validated by the broader research community. So I smiled politely and let the conversation drift to safer topics. Rebecca's upcoming conference presentation, Jason's vacation plans, the new restaurant that had opened downtown. We sang "Happy Birthday" around a chocolate cake Mom had ordered from my favorite bakery. Everyone gave thoughtful gifts and warm hugs and promises to stay in better touch. And I went home to my apartment thinking about the email I'd received 3 days earlier from Dr. Margaret Chin, senior editor at Nature, informing me that the final reviewer comments on my paper were overwhelmingly positive and that I should expect publication decisions within 2 weeks. 2 weeks turned out to be exactly 10 days. I was sitting in my laboratory on the following Tuesday afternoon, analyzing protein expression data from my latest batch of stem cell cultures, when my phone rang with a number I'd been hoping to see. Dr. Anderson, this is Dr. Margaret Chin from Nature magazine. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. My heart rate spiked, but I kept my voice steady. Not at all, Dr. Chin. Thank you for calling. I have excellent news about your submission. The editorial board has voted unanimously to publish your paper on stem cell telomere maintenance mechanisms. More than that, we'd like to feature your research as this month's cover story. I closed my eyes and felt 9 years of work crystallize into this single moment. Nature magazine cover story. The most prestigious publication in all of science, read by researchers in every field, the journal that published Darwin's evolutionary theory and Watson and Crick's DNA structure. Dr. Anderson? Are you there? I'm here. I'm just processing this news. I understand completely. Your research represents a fundamental breakthrough in our understanding of cellular aging. The implications for regenerative medicine and longevity research are staggering. Our editorial team is calling it the most significant advance in stem cell biology in the last decade. I thanked Dr. Chin and hung up the phone, then sat in my laboratory chair staring at cell culture dishes while the reality of the situation settled over me. In less than a week, researchers around the world would be reading about my discovery. Pharmaceutical companies would be calling with licensing offers. Medical schools would be inviting me to give lectures. The research that Dad had dismissed as failed experiments would be recognized as groundbreaking science. But first, I had a birthday celebration to conclude. I drove back to my parents' house, where the family was still gathered around the dining room table, picking at leftover cake and continuing the conversation about my uncertain career prospects. "Sarah," Mom exclaimed as I walked back through the front door. "Did you forget something?" "Actually, I wanted to share some news," I said, pulling out my phone as it rang again with Dr. Chen's number. "This is the call I've been waiting for." Dad looked up from his conversation with Uncle Bob about golf handicaps. "What call?" I put the phone on speaker and answered. "Dr. Anderson, this is Margaret Chin from Nature again. I apologize for calling back so quickly, but our media relations team wants to coordinate the press release for your cover story. The New York Times, Washington Post, and CNN have already submitted interview requests based on the preliminary announcement." The dining room fell completely silent. Dad's fork stopped halfway between the cake plate and his mouth. Rebecca, who had been describing her latest surgical technique to Aunt Linda, turned to stare at me with wide eyes. "Press release," Mom whispered. Yes, Dr. Chen's voice continued through the speakerphone. Dr. Anderson's breakthrough in stem cell aging mechanisms is being hailed as a potential game-changer for regenerative medicine. We're expecting significant media coverage when the issue publishes next week. Dad set down his fork with a hand that was visibly trembling. Margaret, could you explain what exactly Sarah discovered? Dr. Anderson has identified the molecular mechanism that allows certain stem cell populations to maintain telomere length indefinitely, essentially making them immune to cellular aging. The implications for treating age-related diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease, are extraordinary. This could be the foundation for therapies that extend healthy human lifespan by decades. The birthday cake sat forgotten on the table as everyone stared at me like I'd suddenly revealed the ability to fly. Dr. Anderson, Dr. Chen continued, Harvard Medical School has already called requesting your availability for a faculty position. The Broad Institute wants to discuss establishing a new research center around your work. And I should mention that Regeneron, Genentech and Johnson & Johnson have submitted preliminary licensing inquiries through our legal department. I thanked Dr. Chen and ended the call, then looked around the table at family members who were seeing me clearly for perhaps the first time in 9 years. Sarah, Dad said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, you're going to be on the cover of Nature magazine? Next month's issue, I confirmed, sitting back down at the table and reaching for my abandoned piece of cake. The editorial board called it the most significant advance in stem cell biology in the last decade. Your failed experiments, Rebecca said, staring at me with something that looked like awe, are going to change medicine? That's what the peer reviewers concluded, I said, taking a bite of chocolate cake as if I weren't describing research that would reshape how the medical community understood human aging. Jason's face filled the computer screen, his earlier distraction replaced by intense focus. Sarah, when you say licensing inquiries from pharmaceutical companies, I mean that the 3 largest biotech companies in the world want to discuss turning my research into actual therapies that could treat age-related diseases, I said. Early projections suggest potential applications worth tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue. Dad opened his mouth, closed it, then seemed to forget how speech worked entirely. My phone buzzed with a text from my department chair. CNN wants to interview you tomorrow morning. New York Times science reporter is flying in tonight. Harvard called offering full professor with tenure. I showed the text to Dad, who read it twice before handing my phone back with shaking hands. Sarah, Mom said, reaching across the table to touch my hand, why didn't you tell us how important your research was? I considered the question carefully. I tried to explain it many times. But you couldn't see the significance until Nature magazine validated it for you. The admission hung in the air like incense. For 9 years I'd been describing my work to family members who measured success in terms of immediate, tangible outcomes. They couldn't understand that some of the most important discoveries in human history had emerged from basic research that seemed irrelevant to practical concerns. We thought, Dad said slowly, that you were just playing around in laboratories. I was playing around in laboratories, I agreed. That's how scientific breakthroughs happen. You experiment with cellular mechanisms until you discover something that changes everything. My phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, director of the National Institute on Aging. Dr. Anderson, I hope you're prepared for what's about to happen. Your Nature paper is going to make you the most famous aging researcher in the world overnight. We'd like to discuss a 10-year research grant that could fund the largest longevity study in human history. After hanging up, I noticed that everyone at the table was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to something that looked suspiciously like reverence. The most famous aging researcher in the world, Aunt Linda repeated slowly. Apparently, I said, finishing my birthday cake while my family processed the reality that the person they'd seen as the professional disappointment had just achieved the kind of scientific recognition that most researchers only dream about. Dad cleared his throat. Sarah, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. For what? I asked, genuinely curious. For not believing in you. For not understanding that what you were doing was important. For suggesting that 20 years of research was a waste of time. 9 years, I corrected gently. But I understand why you couldn't see the significance. Cellular aging mechanisms aren't exactly dinner table conversation. But we're not strangers, Rebecca said, her voice thick with emotion. We're your family. We should have trusted that you knew what you were doing. You should have asked better questions about my research instead of assuming it was irrelevant. I agreed. But I also understand why you didn't. What I do is pretty abstract until it results in something like this. Over the next 2 weeks, my life transformed completely. The Nature paper generated more media coverage than any scientific publication I'd ever seen. CNN, BBC, NPR, and 60 other news outlets ran features about the breakthrough that could extend human lifespan. Harvard offered me a full professorship with a starting salary higher than Dad's surgical income. Pharmaceutical companies submitted licensing bids totaling over $2 billion for the rights to develop therapies based on my research. My family, meanwhile, became my biggest advocates. Dad started telling his golf buddies about his daughter, the genius scientist whose research will cure aging. Mom carried copies of the Nature issue in her purse to show anyone who would look. Rebecca called me for advice about incorporating longevity research into her cardiology practice. Jason offered to help negotiate the pharmaceutical licensing deals. The birthday dinner that was supposed to be another intervention about my career choices became the moment when my family finally understood that some achievements can't be measured in traditional terms until they reach a level of recognition that makes their importance undeniable. I used part of the initial licensing revenue to establish the Anderson Institute for Cellular Aging Research, providing funding for graduate students whose work is too experimental for traditional grant agencies. Students like I had been working on projects that their own families might not understand until the breakthrough moment arrives. The research that Dad dismissed as 20 years of failed experiments turned out to be 9 years of foundational work leading to discoveries that could potentially extend healthy human lifespan by decades. Sometimes the most important contributions to human knowledge come from people working on problems that seem irrelevant to practical concerns, in pursuit of understanding that takes years or decades to yield applications. Sometimes playing around in laboratories is the most serious work of all. And sometimes time does tell exactly as promised.